Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's executive meeting. First thing I'd like to do is just to record the apologies that we've received from Councillors Wooderson, Mason and Eyre, and to welcome everybody else, councillors and officers, to the meeting, those joining us as public participants and those watching along at home as well. In particular, can I welcome Martin Kelly to the table in his first meeting as our new Corporate Director for Children, Young People and Education. So welcome to York. The first agenda item is declarations of interest. So I'll give a couple of seconds in case any colleagues have any declarations, but I can't see any additional declarations to declare. Thank you very much. The second agenda item is public participation. Before I go on to public participation, Superintendent Mark Khan from North Yorkshire Police is joining us today in order to speak about agenda item 4, city centre access. But Superintendent Khan is on duty today at York Races, and so is joining us virtually to be able to join us. Superintendent Khan, I just wanted to check whether you wanted to go first and answer questions, or whether I could go to our public speakers first, which would be approximately 10 minutes.
I'm happy for you to go to your public speakers, Chair.
Great, thank you very much. So in which case I can move to agenda item 2, public participation, and we have 3 registered public participants for tonight's meeting, and all 3 are registered to speak on agenda item 4, city centre access security measures. Our first public speaker is Flick Williams, and you have 3 minutes to talk to us.
Financially, local government is often considered a leaky bucket, but again, you take the prize. This time for such poor management of the HVM project, you are now committing us to an eye-watering £3.5 million. This must in turn necessitate the revisiting of proportionality. The counter-terror consultant says it is. Well, he would. The security industrial complex is getting rich off the back of this government's forthcoming protect duty, and we don't even get to properly interrogate these decisions because it is shrouded in secrecy, hidden behind walls of intelligence and national security obfuscation. Housing and community safety scrutiny has already heard me question the financial wisdom of this decision. The counter-terror expert we consulted about it said terrorists will always mount an attack where they see a weak link. The threat shifts geographically in response to defences. The interim report said counter-terror officers have 3 to 4 suspected lone wolf actors under surveillance at any time. Proportionate? I don't think so. But as we are not allowed to question that, let's return to the money. The raiding of the highways budget will adversely affect every citizen, be they pedestrian, cyclist or motorist. But like so much else, it will disproportionately affect disabled people. I could show you my broken caster wheel, which was sheared across by trying to mount a so-called drop curb after 16 months of being abused by the paving and road surfaces in this city. I attract attention crossing at signalised crossings such as Layerthorpe and Micklegate, where I have to weave a zigzag path across the road to avoid the massive potholes and the spine-shattering jolts that result if I fail to see one in time. A surveyor who visited recently said the pavements he saw here were some of the worst he has ever seen. But don't take it from me. Let's consult the report you commissioned and paid more taxpayer money for last summer. MHA report, page 52. Generally, the foot streets are considered to be in poor condition. On most foot streets, pavements are too narrow, too uneven, or have too severe a camber for people using wheelchairs to be able to use them. So little chance of any of that getting fixed then. Just last month, you talked of accelerating work to make such improvements, an impossibility once you have plundered the highways budget to pay for HVM. History in the making, the great highways robbery of 22, perpetrated on council tax-paying citizens of York by your Lib Dem Green administration without masks or pistols. Unlike the punishment meted out to Dick Turpin on the Knavesmire, yours will come in the ballot box in a mere 258 days' time, when citizens get to judge for themselves how judiciously you have been spending our money. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments, which we'll take into account when we consider the agenda item for later in the meeting. Our second public speaker today, also joining us remotely, is Diane Roth, who's also registered on the same agenda item, and you have 3 minutes to talk to us.
Thank you. I speak against the recommendations in agenda item 4. Please do not give delegated power to accept the one tender received and take an additional £1.7 million out of future budgets. Why? Because the proposal allows a scheme which is not fit for purpose to be imposed on York residents and visitors, despite constant opposition to it. A solution must be found that does not exclude disabled people and their families and friends from their own city centre, denying local businesses the hard cash we pour into a centre that is becoming less relevant the more people you exclude. The York economy needs our business. And it's not just disabled people with a blue badge saying that. It's businesses and well over 2,000 people who have registered their opposition to the HVM scheme in the last 3 months. The papers presented here tonight tell you only one side of the story. They do not tell you the ways in which this scheme could have been made to work for everyone, because the council didn't work up any alternative solutions. That's despite being given them on a plate in the Martin Higgett report, which it commissioned and ignored. The reports don't give any indication to the depth of advice sought and given by counter-terrorism officers. If you ask them if this is a good scheme, then they would they recommend it? Of course they will say yes, because it's simple and easy. If you had asked them to work with you and disabled groups to co-produce a scheme, or indeed what they thought about the Martin Higgett report, they might have said yes to that too. Being that you, the City Council, and the police both have public sector equality duties and are both required to identify and amend discriminatory practice, we have seen no evidence whatsoever that you have done that, but we have seen many flawed equality impact assessments. The legislation is not yet in place, and despite scaremongering in the report, it is extremely unlikely you will be compelled to have physical barriers in place in 2023. Plans, yes, barriers, probably not. Take this opportunity to review these bad plans. Not bad because they seek to protect people, but bad because they one-size-fits-all approach that is dividing our city. We have lived without barriers since Christmas. Put the temporary ones back in at Christmas and take your time to see what the legislation actually says. See what results of the zone project highlighted in the regional CTSA manager's letter, and start to represent the interests of all the people of York, not just those who want a car-free city centre. Martin's Law, as it is known, or the Protect duties, are about being proportionate. In your management of risk, resources and cost, these plans have none of those characteristics. On the basis of cost alone, now is the time
to a close, please.
On the basis of cost alone, now is the time to revise them. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments, and that will be taken into account when we consider agenda item 4. And our third public speaker is Councillor Melly, also registered on the same agenda item, and you have 3 minutes.
Thanks. Good evening. The public needs to be safe, but people also need to be included. Nobody should be excluded from their own city, public realm and local services on the basis of a protected characteristic. It's discrimination. This scheme of hostile vehicle mitigation measures needs to be designed with accessibility in mind. Outright banning blue badge holders cannot be proportionate or acceptable. We need effective safety measures that also allow for necessary access. Yet instead of a well-designed, well-managed inclusive scheme, we have yet another over-budget, behind-schedule discriminatory scheme. It's almost £2 million over budget, with the extra money to be ransacked from the Highways Maintenance Programme budget. The roads and pavements in our city are an absolute state. The potholes, cracks and damaged pavements are causing hazards in every ward, including the city centre. They're causing accessibility issues and making cycling less safe. There's no money to spare from the Highways Maintenance Programme. though you intend to take it from future budgets beyond the next local election, so I suppose you're expecting that to be somebody else's problem. That's without even considering the additional costs of yet another year of temporary hostile vehicle mitigation measures for Christmas, because the purpose-built scheme won't be in place. Measures which we know are even more inaccessible than the permanent measures will be. So many access issues were caused last Christmas season by these measures when the barriers weren't opened for wheelchair and other mobility aid users. You know that, but yet you'll implement the exact same measures this year. Please reconsider the details of this scheme and its access arrangements so they keep people safe without discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments that will get taken into account when we consider the agenda item later. So I'd like to thank our three public participants at that stage and quickly move on to agenda item 3, the forward plan. That's listed on pages 1 to 2. I'll just give colleagues a couple of seconds to indicate, please, that they're happy to accept the forward plan. So that's a clear consensus in favour of accepting the forward plan. Thank you very much, which then means we can move straight on to agenda item 4, city centre access security measures. As I said at the start of the meeting, we're joined virtually by Superintendent Mark Khan, and we've agreed that Mark can speak and answer questions at the start so that he can then return to dealing with York races. I wonder, and equally welcome Sean Tunstall to the room, who's the counter-terrorism security advisor. I wonder, Sean, if you wanted to join the table at the same time, and you might want to add anything after Superintendent Khan has spoken. Yes, please. And similarly, may want to answer questions. Just indicate whenever you want to. I'll then obviously open it to any questions from councillors, and then I'll hand over to Neil and officers who will similarly introduce the paper, and we'll have an opportunity to answer them questions at that stage. And please do stay at that point, Sean, as well. So Superintendent Khan, thank you for waiting and for joining us. I'll hand over to you first.
Thank you, Chair. There was a couple of questions that I was sent through by Neil to provide an answer to. I think there were general questions. The first one was around a threat assessment and where do our threat assessments come. I'm sure Sean will be able to give more detail on this after I've talked as well. But basically, in a nutshell, the counter-terrorism threat assessment is the responsibility of the Joint Threat Analysis Centre, which is shortened to JTAC, which is part of the security service. JTAC receives information, intelligence, both nationally and internationally, and uses that information and intelligence on counter-terrorism to pass on information to the counter-terrorism policing Northeast regional team and the other counter-terrorism teams, and then ultimately to police forces and the local authority. JTAC are responsible for setting the threat assessment, the national threat assessment, which is currently at substantial, that an attack is likely. So that's where we get our threat assessment from. It's a threat assessment that is for the whole of the United Kingdom, and we, as a police force, we respond and use that threat assessment when we give out our recommendations and advice for things like the HVM installation in York. Is there any further detail that you want from that, Chair?
No, that's fine. If you carry on, and we could open it for questions afterwards.
Yeah, and then the second question that I was asked to comment on was there was a comment about it being this type of HVM being put in place in other cities, both regionally and nationally. I have less sort of knowledge about HVM plans in particular cities across the country. What I can say though is that HVM, hostile vehicle mitigation, is, if you walk around any city in the UK, and let's talk about our own city in York, you will see hostile vehicle mitigation all over our city already. So, for example, outside the racecourse, outside the York railway station, outside the Minster. So it's something that, what I'm trying to say from that is that in a city like ours, we are already responding to the threat that potential hostile vehicles might pose. So businesses like the racecourse, the church, Network Rail, the railway station are already responding to that. The issue for us in York is that our publicly accessible space within the city, the publicly accessible locations within the city centre are very, very tight. We have at times many people in a very, very small area. So that would make an attack far more successful for someone that would want to carry it out. There's also less room for people to jump out of the way or escape from a vehicle coming to that area. So for me, and that's my personal opinion, I think somewhere like York, especially the streets in York, are particularly vulnerable. So is there any further on those two questions?
No, thank you very much. Is there any general comments you wanted to make, or would you prefer us to go to questions?
Yeah, I mean, the general comments are that you know, this is a recommendation. We provide a recommendation. We support the counter-terrorism policing Northeast, CTP Northeast, and JTAC. We follow that assessment and analysis that they make, and as North Yorkshire Police, that would be we would agree with that threat assessment. We don't have our own bespoke threat assessment, apart from the fact that I've worked and lived in York for many years. I've visited many different cities, both in the UK and in Europe. And from my personal experience, I would suggest that there is a vulnerability in York that we would need to address. Absolutely.
Thank you very much. If you could stay on the line, Mark, that would be appreciated. Sean, I didn't know if you had anything to add.
Well, I'm a counter-terrorism security advisor for the counter-terrorism.
Sorry, I think the button may or may not be pressed on your microphone, just for the recording.
That's it.
Thank you very much.
I've hearing problems myself, so I understand that. I'm a counter-terrorism security advisor, and I work for the Counter-Terrorism Police Northeast. I am accredited to give advice on protected security around terrorism, and I've been in the role for the last 14 years, so I've quite a lot of experience in that role. In the last 8 years or so, I've worked at York District and become involved with York District through the Protect and Prepare group, which has been established for the last 5 years, way ahead of most places nationally and that have similar projects ongoing. One of the first things that I encountered when I came to York about 6 or 7 years ago was the obvious vulnerability of the streets and the city centre in particular to some form of terrorist attack involving a vehicle, whether that be a bomb, an improvised explosive device in a vehicle, or the more current methodology where we see vehicles being used as weapons and being driven into people deliberately, etc. And having worked to some extent on the scheme that is in place now in Leeds, I would say personally, and this has been backed up by other people, that York is more vulnerable, in my opinion, than Leeds is because of the tight spaces, because of the need to try and escape from any such attack is very difficult because of the nature of the city centre and how it's laid out. So the best solution for something like the problem that we've got and the vulnerabilities we've got in the city centre in particular is some form of vehicle access scheme. It's always been referred to as a hostile vehicle mitigation scheme, which it is, but it also does have some flexibility in terms of what it enables businesses, etc., to do. Now, I'm not somebody who has an opinion and then thinks that opinion is right. Right at the outset, I spoke to the experts, the scientists at the Centre for the Protection of National Infrastructure. They deal with national infrastructure projects, etc. And about 5 years ago, I actually got the head of the Hostile Vehicle Mitigation Unit, which is part of the CPNI, Centre for Protection of National Infrastructure, to come to York himself to give us his opinion as to what he thought were the vulnerabilities and what the solutions were. He came on 2 occasions and he basically said that what my sort of thoughts were absolutely correct. And I understand that since then he's actually been to your corporate management people and actually said the same thing in the presence of them. He is the ultimate expert in the country. He is nationally recognised and internationally recognised and is responsible for many of the schemes that you will see in the city centres and in particular around London. So I've not done this on my own. I've actually got the best people in to be able to tell us about what they think in terms of the vulnerability and the potential mitigation that can be put in place. And that's where we came up with the idea of the vehicle access scheme, the hostile vehicle mitigation, which runs, of course, alongside the things like the Christmas market, which is temporary HVM, etc. But I strongly believe that at the moment, and Mark spoke about the JTAC assessment, the terrorist threat is becoming more unpredictable. There's less chance, I suspect, that the security services and the police are going to be able to know what's coming down the line. And before we know it, something will happen. So for us, it's a good move to get this sort of scheme in place. It's been on the table now, I understand, for 3 or 4 years. And in my view, it's something that is needed in York, more so than I've seen in most other cities that I've dealt with.
Thank you very much. I'll open it to any questions to Mark and to Sean from colleagues. One from me first, which Mark did touch on, and in fact you both did, which was, could you tell us a bit more about work that has happened or is happening across the wider region or nationally to counter these attacks? So I think Leeds was referenced, and obviously there's been a number of high-profile incidents in London, but just understanding that a little bit more would be helpful. Don't know if Sean, if you want to go first, and then Mark, I'll bring you in.
Well, there have been numerous incidents with regards to vehicles, in particular vehicles that have been driven into people. And I think one of the biggest concerns coming from JTAC at the moment is that these are unpredictable events. They are still occurring. There's certainly been some recent ones in Europe and in America. And there are some concerns also around mental health issues. Some of these types of attacks have been carried out with people with mental health issues and perhaps with some connection with terrorism. So we know that it's a low complexity attack methodology. You don't need lots of people to be involved in a sustained, well-planned attack. This is just something that someone could just take upon themselves, having been radicalized in terms of terrorism, and then carry out an attack.
Thank you. Mark.
Yeah, from my perspective, Chair, it's looking at the local view, and that's what I was trying to say in terms of York itself. We do already have vehicle access schemes or HVMs in place in certain locations. Also across North Yorkshire, for example, the Scarborough Open Air Theatre has already put vehicle mitigation in there. And so what I would say is it's a threat assessment that is being taken seriously by other businesses and as I said, the church and things like that already. So you can see it when you walk around in city centres and town centres and vulnerable locations. You can already see how the threat is being addressed with the mitigation. So York City Centre, for me, just echoing what Sean says, is a vulnerability and needs some kind of permanent vehicle access scheme from my perspective, because of the threat of our small city streets.
Thank you very much. Councillor de Gorn.
Yes, I think probably largely cover this, but the report does you say on page 15 that the counter-terrorism policing consider the evidence the proposals to be evidence-based and proportionate to the current threat. Obviously, some of the comments that have just been made, I think just playing devil's advocate a little bit, this particular scheme, obviously we've got significant costs to consider. Is this perhaps some question is really, is this the most appropriate action that we can take compared to other threats that people might suggest we should be equally concerned about elsewhere in the city? Is this the most cost effective, for want of a better word, way of trying to protect the largest number of people in the city?
Thank you. Sean.
I can only speak for terrorist issues. I can't speak for other general sort of threats that you may be referring to there. But what I can tell you is that in terms of the information that we get nationally, that the head of the sort of attack methodology that we're most likely to see next time sits vehicle as a weapon. And that is driving a vehicle basically into a public area, a public space, and driving into people. I mean, I walked around York today, and the amount of pavement cafes that are just sat there in the middle of the road would be just ideal targets for anybody who had a thought around carrying out an attack of that form. So in terms of attack methodology and what we're likely to see, it sits right up there at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Mark.
Yeah, again, in terms of cost, that's not something for me to consider. But what I would say in terms of what we are already doing as a police force in North Yorkshire Police around counter-terrorism, we have Project Servitor, which we deploy on regular basis. That's around hostile reconnaissance. That deploys both in York and across the rest of North Yorkshire. We also have a dedicated firearms support unit, which is our other response, which we stand up 24/7 in terms that, I mean, that's to deal with any type of firearms threat, but that would also deal with a terrorist who had, for example, an inclination to use a knife to carry out an attack. So there is already investment by the police in our counter-terrorism work that we are doing. So having vehicle mitigation helps. It's just another form of protecting the public and is part of a whole wide toolkit and will address different types of attack methodology.
Thank you very much. This might be a question for Sean or for Neil, but in the report, it talks about the design stages, identifying new products that better address the risks at specific locations in York. So it's whether we can have a bit more information on those products and why they're better. Okay, nearly saying that the officers can answer that one later and some specifics. I don't know whether there's anything, Sean, you wanted to add at this stage.
No, my advice is just that, it's advice. And also, as I say, I've supported that with real expert advice in terms of what's available, in terms of products and the costs, etc. I'm afraid that's out of my hands. It would be wrong of me to sort of get involved in that sort of thing, because I have to sit as an independent and just be that advisor, which is what I've done. What I can say is that in the last 5 years, you've had a protect and prepare group consisting of the police, experts, council, etc., set up in York, which is looked at as being nationally the best that there is. And this subject has been discussed on a number of occasions and various issues that have been brought up. So it's been subject to a lot of discussion, a lot of debate and a lot of expert input. So it's not something that's just been sort of put on the table and then it's disappeared. It's always been discussed. You know, I'm in my, 4th year of discussing this. Working with Catherine at the back in the council, etc. And Mark's right, there are other schemes around, but the main vulnerability for me in York is the city centre, because of the nature of the city centre, how busy it is, etc. And one of the things that I have to give consideration to is, you know, the bigger picture in terms of the impact of an attack like this in York, in terms of the economy, in terms of the credibility of York, the reputation of York, in terms of the tourism, etc. It's absolutely massive should an attack take place. That's what I do know, and I can say.
Thank you very much. Councillor Douglas.
Thank you for that information. It's really helpful. And it's just a very simple question. Can you confirm your surname for me, please? I missed it when you introduced yourself.
Okay. Tunstall.
Stall.
T-U-N.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
S-T-A-L-L.
Tunstall. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I can't see any further questions. So obviously just to thank Sean and to thank Mark. And I think at this stage, Mark, you need to return to hopefully a quiet evening following York races.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, Mark. And what I'll now do is, if Gary and Catherine would like to join us at the table, and please do stay, Sean, as well, just in case you wanted to chip in or contribute to any of the answers. We will now ask Neil to introduce once Gary, Catherine and are at the table. Thank you very much, Neil.
Thank you, Chair. Before I introduce the report, just to address some of the issues raised by the public speakers. So just in respect of blue badge holders, to be really clear, the report in front of you this evening isn't discussing or debating or making any recommendations into the way that the infrastructure is managed on a day-to-day basis. So those issues have previously been addressed by the executive and deliberated at length, and decisions made in that regard. So that isn't the subject of today's report. In respect of the comments around money wasted and the sheer cost, etc., I think we need to put this in the context that you are responsible for £1.2 billion worth of highway assets. We're actually talking about an incredibly, relatively small sum compared to the assets that you're managing on a day-to-day basis on behalf of the citizens of York. And those are highway assets, huge quantities of those assets are doing exactly the same as these assets, protecting people's lives. So in terms of barriers, making sure that we've got zebra crossings in place, traffic lights in place, etc. All of these functions, all this infrastructure that you provide for the people of York is to protect lives. And this is part of that suite of infrastructure. So I think in terms of Councillor de Gaunt's questions about proportionality, you're spending a huge amount of money on highway safety, and this is part of that piece. In terms of the impact on highway maintenance, the proposal is to bring forward, as the speaker noted, budget from 26-27. That budget over that 5-year period is in the order of £37 million. The movement forward that's proposed in the report is not going to have an impact on highway maintenance this year or next year. And as is noted, it will be a matter for members at that time to consider the condition of the highway, the level of government grant, and clearly as well, in respect of the York area, members are going to consider in September the possibility of having a combined authority, and there'll be additional funding coming into the transport function during that period as well. In respect to the comments around the temporary scheme, I think it is a fact, as stated by the member of the public, the temporary schemes are costly. They are less accessible than the permanent measures, and we would like to remove them as soon as we can, which is again the rationale for getting on and delivering this infrastructure now. So just in terms of the report itself, the report represents a significant investment in infrastructure to protect the city's residents, visitors, and as Mr. Tunstall has pointed out, the economy of York as well, because what we've seen in cities where these attacks have taken place is a significant impact on those economies for a number of years after any incident, not setting aside the actual cost of these incidents in terms of human life, etc., and liabilities picked up by the council. In terms of the concerns around the escalating costs relative to budget, the original budget wasn't based upon the current scope and scale of the scheme, and indeed, as we see tonight in the later report on finance, the whole of the economy is being subject to unprecedented inflation and scarcity of resources. And clearly, as these items are principally made of steel and metal and require labour to install them, etc., but the steel and metal is a significant proportion of the current inflationary environment is having a significant impact. So the costs that we have on the table at the moment in terms of the procurement exercise and the budget exercise, I can probably guarantee will just be worse if we did it next year, and even worse the year after, because clearly those costs that are embedded through inflation this year are not going to unwind in the near future, certainly not from any of the forecasts that I've seen in the marketplace. So broadly speaking, Chair, that's the answers from the members of the public and the rationale for you making the decision now and the impact that the budgetary recommendations have. Gary and Catherine are here to answer any questions specifically on the location or installation of the infrastructure and your question as to the nature of the technology.
Thank you very much, Neil. So Gary, Catherine, anything you'd like to add at this stage? And if you could start by picking up my question, happy to repeat it, but I'm sure you'll have got it.
If you wish, I can just give a quick resume of the report. Yeah, so good evening, councillors. I'll take you through the report about the proposed city centre access and security measures. The essence of this report sets out the history of decision making and development of the proposals, but crucially brings us up to date on recent activity. So we can report that the detailed design was completed in June 2022 and the scheme proposals were tendered in July 2022. So earlier this month, one tender was returned, and as expected, in terms of price, it was in excess of the allocated budget. Noting also that there was a quality evaluation also undertaken as part of the process. So the report recommends delegating the acceptance and award of contract to the Director of Transport, Environment and Planning. In order to do that, an additional funding of 1.75 million is required, making a total allocation of 3.4 million. There are a number of reasons for the increase, and just to reiterate what Neil says, but I'll hopefully put a little bit more detail on that. The reasons behind the increase in costs, the principal ones are the increase in construction prices for the cost of steel and concrete, increase in general cost of living and inflation in the UK economy, the use of products recently upgraded to better meet the assessment of York of the risk locations in York, which we'll come on to as one of your questions. And as the design has developed, we've become more aware of the underground apparatus of utility companies, and we're working with them to obviously to minimise diverting or protecting their apparatus by the location of the design. But there will be a factor of that, and that is work in progress. Members are asked to note that the prices will include 5 years servicing and maintenance to ensure maximum functionality and reduce downtime and extend the life of the measures. A communications plan will be developed after award of contract to ensure stakeholders and users of the city centre will be made aware of the construction programme and effect on accessibility. And finally, members should note that the bulk of the work will be undertaken in early 2023, and therefore temporary measures will be required for the Christmas period of this year, which I think you already knew. And so that completes my summary of the report. So would you like to pose the questions?
Yeah, happy to. So just picking up paragraph 25B, where it talks about the design stage having identified new products that better address those specific risks. So it's any more information on those products and why they are better.
Primarily, it's the sliding bollard system. Microphone should be on. Showing green.
Is it on?
It's on green.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah. Primarily, the sliding bollard system has been further developed to a higher rating for, well, there's an option for a higher rating for and that's in terms of the vehicle approach speed. Previously, we were having to accept a risk of the product not being quite as highly rated as ideally we'd need in York for the approach speed, which is a factor dependent on the approach direction and the streets. You can get quite a good run up to most of the junctions. So they have developed newer, heftier products that will resist higher speed vehicles. So those are what the design is based on now. In addition to that, there's been some new developments in ultra shallow fixed bollards and such like. It's an ever changing market as products come on that are further developed.
But the shallowness is beneficial, obviously, means that there's less excavation and less impact on archaeology and utilities. So yeah, there's opportunities there to speed up the construction and avoid additional costs.
Yeah, but particularly where we've got cellars close by, that those products are much more suitable than having to use something other than a bollard.
Thank you very much. Another question from me, which is probably for you, Neil, which I know the answer, but to check is, will the council be receiving any financial support from central government? Is it entirely funded through our own budgets? And obviously that is particularly with an eye on the new protect duty and responsibilities that local authorities are going to pick up.
It is entirely funded, Chair, from our own funds, and as Mr. Tunstall pointed out, The city is one of those leading authorities in the country, but it is also worth reflecting that those other authorities such as Leeds, I think Bath and Bristol are mentioned in the report, they are also funding these assets from their own funds, but clearly with the duty protect and the national risk, and we've heard there's been a national threat assessment, one would hope under the sort of long-standing relationship between local government and central government, new burdens should be reflected with funding to local authorities, but I'm sure we can provide you with any information you need to make those political representations.
Thank you very much. Councillor de Gaulle.
Yeah, just the reference to the complexity around utilities, is that something which we're fairly well advanced in terms of resolving? I'm aware that diverting utilities can take significant amounts of time if that's required, and I suppose that the shallow specification perhaps helps in that a little bit, does it?
Yeah, I mean, the design was principally, to avoid impacting utilities by using shallow footings and such like. However, it's inevitable that there are some that are too shallow, but it's also things like manholes and inspection chambers as well. And it's not just a case of diverting utilities, we're also looking at tweaking the design as well too. So we've got proportionate costs to come up with the best solution for each location, but until the detailed design was finished, every few millimeters count, so it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation.
Okay, and you mentioned about maintenance. I would hope that is something, obviously, in terms of the overall design, that we want these to be as robust as possible for the future. So that would be something that you'd be looking at alongside all the other specific locations.
Yeah, that certainly influenced the selection of the sliding bollard system over the much more difficult and complex difficulties you have around rising bollards.
Okay.
Those were available at the right rating from the start of this project, but we know they're notoriously difficult to maintain.
Neil?
Yeah, if the authority has had a previous experience of what the sliding bollards, I think the Council de Gaulle's alluding to, and once they break, they are notoriously expensive to maintain because they have subterranean features in themselves. So the sliding bollard arrangement was something that we looked at right from the start to make sure that we minimised ongoing revenue costs, but then also in York, it gives us the advantages of installation.
Thank you. Councillor Douglas.
Thank you. I've got two questions. Is there any indication why we've only had one contractor respond to the tender? And also, am I right in understanding that even though the first decision to implement these features was made in 2018, the first detailed design only was done in June 2022? Is that correct?
I'll take the first bit.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the tendering process was an open tender, so it wasn't on any restrictive, it was like national, so anybody could actually put a bid in. And whilst we had about 12 expressions of interest, they gradually fell away, either because they were too busy or they looked at the project and didn't like it. But so, yes, we ended up with just one, unfortunately. Yes, it would have been nice to have a few more. So what was the second part of the question?
I'll pick up the second one, Gary.
So again, sorry.
I'll pick up the second.
Okay.
Yes. So in respect of, yeah, absolutely. In respect of the, move that across here, then maybe better. In respect of the timing, as you are aware, Councillor Douglas, that the authority had to make the decisions as to the scale and scope of the measures that were going to be put in place, and that was principally determined in the decision last November. So in terms of which streets would be protected by hostile vertical mitigation measures, that decision was taken by members last year. There was a previous pre-COVID decision that was a variation on that, and that was reconsidered last November. That that programme was put on pause back in when COVID started. It was reconsidered last November, and a broader footprint considered at the time based on the security advice, and the decision was debated at length and the footprint determined. From that point in time of that decision, then the work has been undertaken at a detailed level then on the streets that are to be protected, and that's necessitated that work being done and completed in June 22. So within the 6-month period following on from the November decision.
Councillor Craig.
Thank you. Yes, I've just got a couple of questions that occurred to me. The public speakers mentioned the plans for the temporary measures at Christmas, and I know Neil's also referred to that, but obviously we know that in some respects they weren't ideal in terms of access and in other ways. And I know I think there's something in the paper that mentions it, but I wonder if one of you could just clarify what measures we're taking this time to do our best to improve those.
We're building on previous experience. I mean, I think the measures will be primarily the same, but we will be looking at reinforcing that training around the security staff at the gate locations in terms of accessibility. They obviously have to take into account of the surrounding security, whether there seems to be a vehicle waiting to come in that they need to account for, rather than just opening the gate because somebody requires access. There might be a delay because they have to assess the safety of opening that measure, but that it was the instructions and will be instructions again this year, and we'll look at the ramps and such like to get up and down the curbs again more carefully. I mean, I'm aware of one incident last year and a few other sort of complaints that they weren't ideal, but we are looking into that.
So we can look at the ramps and the exact location vis-a-vis other obstacles. And
yeah, we've got meetings coming up in September with the supplier and Make It York to just go through those again in detail.
Thank
Neil,
you.
Neil was going to come in on that as well.
Just really to add on to Catherine's point, there will be that meeting we've got convened in September between Make It York, effectively as the organiser of the St Nick's Fair, the national providers, and the lessons that were learned from last year, the unfortunate placement of those barriers down at the bottom of the shambles and the disability access issues that gave. Clearly we addressed that at the time, but we're not going to repeat that this year, and disabled access is going to be clearly at the forefront of our mind in terms of those temporary measures. But I just will repeat that it isn't going to be what we would like to see in terms of the quality that we will achieve through the permanent measures. And I can also say that it is unlikely that there won't be inconvenience to shop owners as well. Because we had that last year in terms of the need to for shop owners in terms of the restocking their premises, that the hostile barriers during Foot Street hours do pose a significant challenge, but we will be working to mitigate them. But what I can't do is sit here and say that they won't be inconvenience, because they are not designed, as we've talked about, and not designed fully and bespoke to the city. And they fulfil a function.
Councillor Crackhill.
Thank you. Yes, it was just it's welcome to have in this paper the designs for the various access points, and it just prompted me to it's quite hard to read, quite small, but it just prompted me to ask for the Blake Street access point. We've talked in the past about redesigning that area to incorporate blue badge parking, and I just wondered if there's given the timescale you've given us is now going to be sometime after Christmas, is there any chance of incorporating those plans?
I'm not going to commit to that on the hoof, but what I will say is that executive have clearly instructed transport officers to continually review the opportunities for additional blue badge capacity around the city centre. So now these designs are complete, we've got a tender in place that can guarantee that work will be undertaken. As for their implementation, I'm sure that members will have a view as to what we do with the Blake Street Duncan Place interchange, because clearly there are also wider issues to consider on Duncan Place with the recently approved neighbourhood plan and the ambitions that the Minster have for the whole of Duncan Place. So there's some wider issues for us to consider there as well.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So, Councillor Waller, and then I think we'll be moving to comments. Councillor Waller.
Thank you. I think in terms of the report here tonight, I'm sure we would prefer to live in a world where we don't need to consider these potential impacts on the city centre, but recognising that they do happen. And earlier on, it was referred to incidents, and that's happened in our Twin City Munster, where outdoor seating was the target for a domestic terrorist to drive a vehicle into. I think what I'd just like to ask, and perhaps it's Mr. Tunstall I should ask, is tonight's paper is very much about hostile vehicle barriers, but there are broader duties which will be put upon institutions to deal with different types of terrorist threats. And so it's really understanding how this works with those duties that are coming down the line, which would answer some of the questions the public are saying, well, this is all very well in relation to a hostile vehicle, but there are other ways in which terrorists operate. So it's understanding how this works with a holistic approach towards reducing risk to crowded areas.
You might need the microphone, not because we can't hear, but just to pick it up for the recording.
But to answer your question, there is an awful lot of work going on behind the scenes. If you think about hostile vehicle mitigation, what other measures could you use to stop a vehicle from travelling down a road and crashing into people? What we have done, and done a lot of work in York in particular, is to look at some of the softer issues around protective security for all sorts of terrorism, whether it be a lone attack, or whether it be an IED, any sort of attack. And we've done an awful lot of counter-terrorism training, which is ongoing, which the council support, and which we do every year. We work very closely with event organisers. We ask them to risk assess around terrorism, and ask them to undertake the training that we offer, etc. So we do an awful lot through the group to get a more holistic approach to what we can do to counter the threat of terrorism generally. Now, you know, when we started looking at this project 4 or 5 years ago, I actually went round myself to a lot of the premises in York and gave them a lot of advice, gave them a lot of signposting in terms of where they could get information from, asked them for their staff to attend training, asked them about their security planning in terms of evacuation, lockdown, etc. These will be terms that you may well be familiar with. So all that went on around the periphery of perhaps the hostile vehicle mitigation. But as I say, you know, what else can you do other than put a physical barrier in place to stop someone from actually driving into people? I can tell people how to get out of the way. I can tell them how to plan against a knife attack, etc., which is what we do. We do a lot in York, probably more so than anywhere else. But the hostile vehicle mitigation is the sort of outstanding issue a little bit, if you like, in terms of what we're doing within the group. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. So I'll open it for any comments from colleagues first. Go to Councillor Gorham first.
Right, thank you. As both the report says, but in particular the contributions to today's meeting, we do have a strong advice from counter-terrorism and police to progress installation of these measures to protect public safety in these highest footfall locations within our city centre. And has also been referred to, this is very much in line with government proposals for a protect duty, which, as you've heard, would apply not just to ourselves, but also to other vulnerable locations and venues across the city, and place a statutory duty on the council to ensure these types of measures are in place. The permanent measures will be like those already installed in Parliament Street, with the sliding bollards that were being referred to at the agreed entry points as in the plan. I think given the challenges facing us in terms of this permanent installation, we quite rightly have been discussing a little bit the temporary measures for this coming Christmas, which we will have to install in the lead up to Christmas, as we've done previously. But as you've heard, we will learn from experience and try to ensure that they are adjusted as much as possible to maintain access for all who need that. And that will, of course, increase the cost short term, which once we come to the point of installing these, will in the longer term avoid us having to make those additional funding decisions. And as you've heard, unfortunately, with the inflation, particularly of energy and materials costs, that costs of construction have had a significant impact on what we had anticipated. But as others have said, it's inevitable these costs are not going to get any cheaper. We've clearly gone through a very careful process to determine locations, the nature of the measures that we want to put in place to try and minimise any difficulties we might have once they've been installed. So ultimately, I think this is a really important responsibility for us to deliver. And by installing a visible deterrent and physical barrier, we are acting on that expert advice, working in line with the proposed legislation, and more important, helping protect local residents and visitors from something that would potentially devastating both for the individuals and for the city. So I very much support the recommendations.
Thank you very much. Councillor Douglas.
Thank you, Chair. And, I'd like to say for a start that I couldn't agree more. The safety of the city is tremendously important and, of course, has to be considered within every decision that we make. But I don't think that it negates our responsibility to consider value for money. And when I look at the length of time that this decision has taken to make, from the first consideration in 2018, and before I'm told that COVID has happened in the middle of that, of course it has, but it still was 18 months roughly between the decision being made and COVID hitting. And I feel that if we had pressed ahead with this project earlier on, then we wouldn't be looking at having to put in 1.75 million from existing budgets, diverting it into this important project. So that's the perspective that I come at from this when I challenge you on the value for money and our decision making. It's too slow. And I think that the public would be in agreement that generally our decision making from inception through to realisation is too slow. I also would like to say that I don't think that actually it is quite right that we don't acknowledge that the public speakers are right to bring up the challenges we have around access and its consideration at this point in time. I think every time we look at putting measures into the city centre that potentially can reduce access for a variety of different people, we should think about it. It can't be put into a silo. And so I was interested to hear Mr. Tunstall's comment that this is an access scheme, and we must view it in that way. Therefore, every time we think about it, we must think about how we mitigate against people being refused access into their city. And we know we have portions of the community who fall within that category, and we've heard from two of them within our public speakers today. So I think it's tremendously important that the people who are most heavily affected by these measures and the access to the services that they have the right to use in our city are considered. So my main comments are value for money from the public, speed of decision making once we know we're going to carry out a project, and always considering equality's impact of what we do at the right time. And I think we may have failed on all of those at some point in time around this project. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we picked up earlier in the debate some of the comments about value for money from Neil and officers on the scheme, and accept, Councillor Douglas, your comments there. Given the previous comments from the Labour group that you would reverse these measures, you could perhaps clarify whether you are in support of the measures.
I'd like to clarify that we have never said that we are against these measures. What we have said is that we would reverse the ban on blue badge holders in the city centre, and that requires us to think creatively about how we allow access to the city centre for those that need it. At this point in time, Councillor Aston, as you know, there are plenty of vehicles that are getting access to the city centre. They haven't been banned yet, as the blue badge holders have. So please don't ask me to, you're putting words in my mouth about a very important and contentious issue for the city, and I don't think it does any of us any favours.
So obviously, as Neil said at the decision in front of us tonight is not about access, it's about the HVM measures. And you, I think I'm reading that obviously concerns about value for money and time, but that in terms of the measures for the security advice, you support that.
Yes, I would rather that the decision was made earlier, that the scheme was implemented earlier, that it cost us less money therefore, and also that we didn't have the contention that we do in the city around access to certain parts of the community. But we absolutely need to have a safe city, and therefore we're in support of the measures. Absolutely.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure most colleagues around the table would all agree that we would prefer the measures to cost less, but for the reasons outlined. I think the only comments I would add is that we know that York is not the only city, as we've heard, looking at this issue, with Bath, Leeds, Chester and Sheffield, just a few working with their police and counter-terrorism advisors to protect high footfall areas. And that's in addition to the government laying out proposals for the new counter-terrorism protect legislation, which Councillor de Gorn referred to, which will replace requirements on councils to deliver protection measures in those busy footfall areas. I think I'd say at this point, I understand the rationale for the creation of the protect duty, but it is disappointing to see the government fail to provide any financial support to local authorities who are delivering on that duty, which picks up on that previous conversation about we would prefer that the measures did not cost what they are. We all know the local government continues to remain heavily underfunded, and the consequences of increasing inflation has meant that the council is having to fund these measures from our transport budgets. So I strongly believe that a better and more coordinated approach is required from the government alongside that new protect duty. So I'd propose that we add a fourth recommendation under paragraph 7, that City of York Council lobbies the Home Secretary to seek financial support with the installation of HVM measures, and that they produce a long-term plan of supporting councils to implement the new protect duty. So I'll come to colleagues to see whether they accept that additional recommendation later in the meeting. And finally, sadly, it has become a fact of life that terrorists can strike at any time and any place without warning. And for me, knowing that the national threat level currently remains substantial, given that we have received strong and repeated advice from the police and counter-terrorism experts, including this evening, it's clear in my mind that not having proactive measures in place is an unacceptable risk. And therefore, with that additional recommendation, I'm content to support the recommendations and see that these essential safety measures are installed at the earliest opportunity. So I'll go to colleagues with that amended recommendation with the additional recommendation. Are you happy to accept the recommendations in front of us this evening? So I can see a clear consensus in favour of accepting those recommendations with that additional fourth recommendation. And I'll just check with Janie at this stage that that additional recommendation was clear.
Chair, if you could just provide me with the wording again, because you did speak very quickly. Apologies.
No, I will do. I'll slow it down. So it's asked that City of York Council lobbies the Home Secretary to seek financial support with the installation of HVM measures, and that the government produces a long-term plan of supporting councils to implement the new Protect duty.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So with that clarification and with colleagues having agreed the recommendations, thank you very much. I'd also like at this stage, obviously, to thank Neil, Gary and Catherine, particularly Mark for joining us early in this meeting, and Sean for attending in person and answering all of our questions. It's appreciated. Thank you very much. That then takes us on to agenda item 5. So agenda item 5 is emergency planning shared service collaboration. And this starts on page 41 to 96. And I'm going to go to Neil to introduce this, please.
Thank you, Chair. Unfortunately, I need to start with an apology to members in that the wrong collaboration agreement was attached in the annex to the report. Subsequently, that has been corrected and you've all been issued with the collaboration agreement for the emergency planning services, and hard copies are available in the room if you wish to look at them. The annex itself is more of the detail. The question in front of you in respect to the report is the principle. It's a principle that we've established within the council, where we've got specialist advisory services to the whole council that are better supported at a regional level because of the opportunity for a greater number of staff to be brought to bear to a very specialist subject area. So we've got that in the health, ironically, the health and safety service, which was the wrong appendix. We take advantage of having more specialist staff available to us in that very bespoke area. What we're talking about here is our emergency planning services, which by their very nature are 24/7. And being a small unitary authority, as you see, prior to COVID, prior to those redundant, those staff leaving the authority, well, just to be clear, no redundancies. Those staff leaving the authority pre-COVID, that actually the need to move to a transitional arrangement or a trial arrangement during COVID was necessary to make sure that we had that 24/7 for our emergency planning function. And COVID and flooding don't take note of each other, and I'm sure other incidents won't take note of each other. So the ability to respond to multiple issues at any one time is really important. Just to give you context, Steve Ball, who's our emergency planning officer, I was discussing this report with just yesterday, was reporting that North Yorkshire, under the new unitary arrangements, have now 12 officers assigned to their emergency planning function. So we would benefit from that significant greater pool of staff to provide that 24/7 service. There is an additional cost that's laid out in the financial measures in the report. It is £21,000 a year, but relatively speaking, I think the resilience that this offers for that relatively small sum will pay itself back in spades in respect of the ongoing safety and security of the city in terms of those events, and particularly being a city that is prone to flooding.
Thank you very much. Councillor Waller.
Thank you. It's just, having been the executive member where the health and safety duties were joined together, I think the importance there was that it was a partnership agreement, and therefore we could see what we were getting out of it. So I think it is getting reassurance that is very much the case here. You did mention flooding. That's something that very often happens in North Yorkshire the same time it happens to us, because the water flows that way. So it's understanding that we wouldn't lose out if we sign up to a joint agreement, because we're facing emergencies of a similar nature at a similar time.
Okay, so to answer your first question, in terms of the partnership, the emergency planning function of York will remain to be staffed by York officers. So Steve and will remain in post. We will still have a seat at the NILERF, so the regional emergency planning function. And in that regard, myself and Ian Floyd sit on that, depending on availability as goal commanders. That would continue, and effectively the strategic lead in any specific incident. So moving on to the second question, the lead would continue to be, that strategic lead would continue to be given by York, but the capacity in terms of the officers effectively deploying resources would be expanded significantly by having the opportunity to have that 24/7 support from those 12 staff in the broader shared service. I think also it's worth reflecting, this is something that my own service areas do on a regular basis. We continue to have responsibility for our own business continuity plans, our own responses as a city to emergencies. They would be developed in York by the people of York, led by the emergency planning officers of York. The principal benefit of this shared service is that we have that capacity for that 24/7 response, which would follow those plans that have been developed in York.
Councillor de Gorme.
I think Neil's covered quite a lot of the points. I think the fundamental choice here really is to ensure that greater resilience, which is obviously what emergency planning is all about, so that instances like I can recall in the last couple of years where we've had a flooding event at the same time as COVID, there may be extreme heat events at the same time as some other events happening. These things can come together, and having that greater capacity to provide duty cover, but also to respond to those situations is the main benefit of this proposal. And I note that it also states in the report that the proposal is to have a rolling 12-month agreement, so that we still keep it under review, and in the light of moves towards a combined authority, we can obviously reflect on whatever changes might take place, but we are already working on across the North Yorkshire and York basis, as you've heard, in relation to health and safety, and this would be continuing something which we brought in place initially as a response to a critical situation that we were facing as an authority, but this will formalise it into an agreement which can be reviewed on a 12-monthly basis. So on that basis, I'm happy to support the recommendation.
Thank you very much. So we've got the recommendations in front of us, just checking the no other comments. So I'll just see if colleagues are happy to accept those recommendations. So it's a clear consensus in favour of accepting those recommendations on agenda item 5. Thank you very much. That then takes us through onto agenda item 6, the finance and performance monitor, and I'll ask Debbie to introduce this to us.
Thank you. So this is the first report of the financial year covering the latest finance and performance information, and highlights the forecast variations. We're continuing to see those pressures in social care, both in terms of demand for the service and the cost of those services. And there are also some pressures in staffing where we've got vacancies that are being covered by agency staff. I think given the current economic climate, the rising interest rates, inflationary pressures, and those ongoing pressures in social care, it's unsurprising that we are expecting a forecast overspend at this relatively early stage in the financial year. I think I know those inflationary pressures will continue to be a challenge throughout the remainder of this financial year. So we will be monitoring the financial impact of that very carefully, and should any action be required or anything to bring to your attention, we'll of course cover that in future reports to executive. At this stage, I am assuming that all of the contingency will be used to offset these forecast financial pressures. And again, as you would expect, we'll be looking at where we can make efficiencies or other savings or restrict non-essential expenditure to try and recover the position. And we'll also be looking again at things like earmarked reserves to make sure that where any money can be released, it can be released to offset this forecast variation. So we do have a strong kind of financial platform upon which to meet these challenges. We do have a very good track record of delivering savings and balancing our budget, but this is clearly a very serious situation for us, and we'll need a significant amount of work from all officers across the council to try and manage the position. So the summary position from a financial point of view is in table 1 at paragraph 12, and then there's a detailed analysis of both finance and performance across all areas of the council in the annexes to the report.
Thank you very much. Open to colleagues for any questions or comments. Councillor Craighill.
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, as Debbie said, some very serious financial issues that we do have to grapple with, but I just wanted to pick up on 2 specific points within the report myself. The first one is one that we've discussed here previously and at scrutiny, and that relates to the average number of days to relet empty council properties. As detailed under paragraph 24 in the report, our building services team continues to experience numerous challenges, including increased competition for skilled tradespeople and the shortage of building materials, coming on top of a post-COVID backlog. This has been making it increasingly difficult to refurbish properties and turn them around to begin letting again. However, council officers have been working, housing officers have been working very hard to improve this situation and are now making progress, for which I really want to thank them for all their efforts and obviously encourage them to continue, which they will do. Earlier this year, an action plan was created to make improvements in the services and address these challenges, and we are now just beginning to see the benefit of this work. The number of empty council homes reduced by 16 in the last 4 weeks of the quarter, and a further 19 homes have had works completed and are now passed for reletting. I believe that we are beginning to turn this round, particularly given that the peak during the second quarter of the last financial year was 152 void properties, and that is reduced to 94 at the end of this quarter in the paper, and is continuing to reduce up to the current time. And that progress is continuing, and we should see further improvements in these figures in quarter 2. So, that is positive news. Secondly, Chair, I'd just like to briefly welcome paragraph 99 of the performance annex. Details the outstanding work of council staff who have processed thousands of payments for residents and businesses who received the energy rebate, the household support fund, and the COVID additional relief fund. As has been mentioned earlier, it hasn't been mentioned earlier, I would say. This is an incredibly difficult time for many residents, families, and businesses. And getting these payments out the door swiftly is so important to supporting our residents and businesses. So I would also like to take the opportunity to thank those teams for their excellent work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll go to Councillor Huntsman and then to Councillor Douglas. Councillor Huntsman.
Thank you, Chair. Looking at the overall picture, I'd like to comment on the financial pressures being felt by adults and children's services, and to emphasise that this issue is not being addressed properly at national level. For too long, local government has received the sticking plasters of one-off financial settlements, but with no long-term plan. This does not properly address the chronic underfunding in the system, which is a national problem. The term zombie government has only been used recently, but on this issue in particular, it has been apparent for much longer. We can also see from paragraphs 43 to 48 on page 112, as part of Annex 1, that inflation, which is completely outside local government control, is having a significant impact on adult social care budgets, with almost 3 million predicted in inflationary pressures. Again, there is still no plan from government to tackle soaring inflation. And not only is this having an impact on the cost of living, but it is negatively impacting key services like those in adults and children's social care. As people live longer, the pressures on local authorities are greater, with no certainty of sufficient funding coming from government to meet our residents' needs. Those were the 2 points I wanted to raise, Chair, and I think we should step up our lobbying efforts to government, particularly as we are fast approaching the next budget setting process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Douglas.
Thank you. I have a question, first of all, and it's for Debbie. So, yeah, the reading of the financial outlook is very concerning and very sobering. And we know, as I mentioned last time, we had executive about inflationary pressures, and I think the outlook is worse now than we thought it was then. And I don't think any of the analysts foresee that that's going to change, certainly over the next 12 months, and they're predicting up to 24 months, which is very concerning. So at this point in time, we've got a projected overspend of over 6 million, 6.74 million for the 12-month period. We've got reserves of 6.9 million. Does this potentially mean that we may have to plug the gap with the reserves, and could this leave us essentially with no reserves come the beginning of financial year 23-24? Thank you.
Yes, you're correct in that the projected overspend is dishearteningly similar to the level of general reserves. So the absolute worst case scenario would be that we would exhaust our level of general reserves, and therefore that would be our first item of budget growth in the following year. So we would increase, the amount of savings we'd need to make in the future. I think the things that stand in our favour at the moment are that it's relatively early in the financial year, so there is the opportunity for us to take action to turn this around. And as I said in my brief introduction, we have been successful in those kind of actions and interventions over recent years. Having said that, that's a lot of work to do, and we can't at this stage guarantee that that won't impact on service delivery, that won't impact on the delivery of the council plan, and that people won't feel the impact of that. I would hope that we could restrict those kind of things to perhaps things that residents might not see the impact of, but clearly of that value, that would be very difficult. So it comes down to, I think, careful prioritisation of what's most needed. And obviously, we have got the cost of living crisis, so we've got to carefully think about where the council can and should intervene, and actually where the council shouldn't intervene, and where we should be relying on national government. So there are a lot of moving parts, and whilst I would agree all the analysts say it's not getting any better in terms of inflation, I think as Neil mentioned in an earlier item, once inflation is at this level, it tends not to come back down, does it? It's not like it's a temporary spike. Prices remain at that high level, so that does put pressure on for the rest of the medium-term financial strategy. And so this is an ongoing challenge. I mean, it's been an ongoing challenge, I think, for us for a number of years. So the advantage of that is that we're pretty good at dealing with it, but it's not going to get any easier for us, if that answers the question.
Thank you for that. Yes, it does. And it leads me on to ask the leader, because in the absence of Councillor Eyre, who's the executive member for finance and performance, and unfortunately isn't here to answer questions about this, what I feel is a tremendously important report. Leader, what are we going to do about this? What decisions are you going to make about what Debbie's mentioned, prioritisation, and how we make sure that we don't end up at the end of 22-23 with no reserves left, going into an uncertain period with no money to call on when we could be in a similar position in subsequent financial years, given the outlook? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll just say that Sartles Councillor has given his apologies and he's on holiday with his family in August, which explains that rather than any reflection on this report. I think for me, the first comment I would echo is Councillor Runciman's point about obviously needing support from the government for local authorities, but specifically around the long-term challenges around social care and sustainable funding for social care stepping forward, which is something that many political parties, professional organisations and associations agree with. And it's certainly a conversation I know we'll keep having with the local government association and where and if at all possible with the government. And then I would equally refer back to Debbie's last answer that this is obviously performance monitor 1. It's relatively early in the year, so we'll have to look for those future performance monitors to hopefully see improvement in an in-year position. And it is not unusual that we do make those improvements during the course of the year, with officers obviously looking at those budgets and where you can stop non-essential spend. And as Debbie said, things that don't impact on services for residents, that action can be taken mid-year. And equally, you start to prepare for your future years budgets and what you want to prioritise. And obviously something we've been looking at really actively at the moment is cost of living crisis and how through financial inclusion schemes we can support and more support residents. So all of the actions that we've previously taken, and I know Councillor Waller will be aware of this process, I think back about a decade now, unfortunately, where we've been in this position that we need more sustainable national funding. But in the absence of that, we'll do everything we can do to maintain those services that residents expect, the most vulnerable, and look at what we can do internally to address that before we get to monitor 2, 3 and 4, and then through the budget process. I don't know, Debbie, if there's anything you wanted to add, although it just mirrors what you have said. Councillor Douglas.
Yeah, I understand how the budget works and how it is monitored and how officers work to that, but there are also plenty of political decisions that will need to be made over the year as well. And the report concerning the capital programme, that is funded, the borrowing for that is funded from revenue as well. And I would imagine that you will need to look at the whole in the round over the next 12 months, because I don't think the public will be overly happy if we end up with a position where we don't have any reserves. And I think, I totally agree with you. We need more money without doubt into public, into local government. It goes without saying, but we have to deal with what we've got in front of us. And I don't think that's going to change, is it, unfortunately? So it does come down to having to make political decisions, Councillor Aston, and I hope that we start that process earlier rather than later. I just wondered if I could make comment as well about some of the performance data. And it was, it really is concerning to me. Councillor Craghill won't be surprised that housing, for me as a Heworth councillor and with the largest proportion of council tenants living in my ward, is of huge importance to me. Property services and repairs and the ongoing programmes that are desperately needed for the maintenance and upgrade of our council properties. And I'm glad to see that some programmes have been progressed, of course, at Bell Farm and also Glen Lodge. I couldn't be happier to see that happening. But we mustn't forget that the health inequalities in our city, one of the biggest factors that impacts that is the quality of housing. We know that there are serious problems with it. We know that tenants have been waiting for years for improvements to their houses. 9 years in some cases for damp and standing water work. And in the meantime, their health deteriorates. And I see this on a weekly basis. It's quite horrifying, to be honest. So I really do want to emphasise to Councillor Craghill that while I understand there are challenges, we simply have to get better within our housing services, turnaround of properties, allowing families to move into tenanted properties when they are overcrowded or living with damp standing water, etc., etc. This impacts on other services. Many of the people that fall under the adults and children's social care system will be impacted by the quality of the housing. And if we don't sort that out, I think we're going to see further cost pressures on into these services because of impacts on mental health and physical health. So if we're going to have a priority within the council, because we are having to think about what we're delivering, I really think that needs to be one of them, delivery of adults and children's services, but also housing quality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And of course, those priorities, in a sense, will be shaped by the council plan that is in place when the budget process is underway. And a couple of years ago, we made sure that the whole budget process was brought forward, and we've committed to do the same again this year in terms of consultation, publication of the proposals, and then equally including individual exec member decision sessions. So all of that work on the budget and the earliest it has ever been will continue to be part of that process. Councillor Craighill.
Thank you. Just very briefly, I would say that I entirely agree with your comments in terms of the principles, Councillor Douglas, of the importance of housing and good quality housing and the impacts on health, social care, and all those connections. So obviously entirely agree with all of that. That is, of course, one of the reasons why we are putting a great deal of focus on turning around the situation with the voids, as I outlined earlier, and with building services and repairs in general. And as I say, it's a big challenge, but I'm really pleased that we are turning that corner on that issue. And that will have advantages. It will have advantages for the budget as we're able to let out more properties as well. And finally, on the standing water, actually, again, you know, we do want to progress more quickly with that. We did a lot of work and progressed quickly in the previous financial year, and work is continuing on that, but we've reached the limits of the procurement contracts that we have in place. So we are having to re-procure those contracts, but that work is also progressing. So again, it's something that we are very much focusing on.
Councillor Smalley.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think I'll just start by thanking Debbie and her teams. Obviously, we have these reports fairly frequently, but I think today we've really got a bit into the detail of it, and we see as councillors far more than I guess the public do, just how much work and officer resource goes into producing all these and the day-to-day financial management of the council. And we don't need to look far, you know, for a sobering reminder of what can go wrong. You know, just look at the Labour-run councils of Slough and Croydon declaring themselves bankrupt due to poor financial management. I would just say, as the state of local government, and particularly the finance of local government, will hit the news in coming months, it's just a reminder to reiterate that those support schemes that we consistently advertise to residents are always available. And our first priority as a council is making sure we support residents through this incredibly tough financial period. In recent days, I've had meetings with the library service and community partners to discuss how we advertise warm spaces in the winter months, as it gets more and more challenging for residents to afford heating their own homes. And so those support schemes that are always advertised and always available, despite obviously the conversations we're having today about the state of local government finance, they will always be there. Our first call will always be to support residents in York that need our support. Moving quickly on to some positive news, because it's not all negative in this update. Some people might have seen recently that in York we were voted the best staycation city by Which magazine, and we can see in that summary on paragraph 23 that footfall in Parliament Street has returned to almost pre-pandemic levels, which is a really, really positive sign for our local economy. And in a similar fashion, the percentage of vacant city centre shops remains well below the national benchmark, with only 8.16% of city centre shops being vacant in York, whilst the national figure has reached 14.4%. And I note as well with a particular smile that in Clifton Moor it's even lower, with 7%. And once the new Go Outdoors is open, that percentage will hopefully fall a bit further. And I think those percentages do mask some of the movement. So in particular, the growth in units, several new units that previously didn't exist will open in that area with the arrival of Starbucks in Clifton Moor, which I'm sure some residents are looking forward to. Lastly, Chair, I want to welcome the fact that cycling levels have returned to pre-pandemic levels, and following that final recalculation of data and having those statistical anomalies removed, it has indeed grown really significantly to pre-pandemic levels. But with that, I'll wrap up my remarks.
Thank you very much. So we've got the recommendation in front of us. Could I please ask colleagues if they're happy to accept that? Thank you very much. So clear consensus in favour of accepting that. So thank you. Which then takes us through to agenda item 7, the capital programme monitor 1, and over to Debbie.
Yep, so this again is the first report of the financial year and sets out progress in delivering the council's capital programme. Continues to be a significant level of investment in a wide range of schemes. I mean, again, obviously price risk and inflation is potentially a significant issue here as well, as we discussed on the previous report, and work is ongoing to try and quantify the overall financial impact on the capital programme delivery, and hopefully future reports will be able to narrow that down a bit and give you a bit more detail, particularly where there might be an impact on an individual scheme. So then, just to say, the report outlines the main variations to the programme as well as highlighting progress made on individual schemes, and there is a summary of the overall programme in the annex to the report.
Thank you very much. So I'll open it for any comments or questions from colleagues. I'll just firstly highlight that similar to those issues that we just discussed in the finance monitor, so from inflation to the pandemic to Brexit to the war in Ukraine, that are having significant knock-on impacts, obviously nationally and here for the delivery of the capital programme. But that said, colleagues will see in the report that the recommended 6.5 million increase to the capital programme is largely to support the delivery of improved facilities for pupils with special educational needs and disabilities. And this is as a result of a successful bid from the council where 3 million was awarded by the Department for Education to support the delivery of some of that work. And that is on top of the 5.2 million that the council has been allocated from the Special Educational Needs and Disabilities grant over the current and next financial year. The report also highlights continued progress on a number of important schemes, including the delivery of new homes. Paragraph 18 highlighting that the construction contracts for both Duncan Barracks and Burnholme have been formally entered into. Whilst on housing, I'd also like to welcome the fact that the energy efficiency works are nearing completion on 44 council homes with the installation of solar PV panels. And this is an incredibly important piece of work responding to the climate emergency, but also equally supporting residents with increasing energy prices. Moving to paragraph 23, it's really pleasing to see a further 1.1 million of funding has been awarded to support the development of Haxby Station. As colleagues will know, delivery of a new railway station in Haxby is an important priority, and this funding in recognition of the merits of the project is welcome. And lastly, I'd like to welcome the fact that our future library investment programme remains on track, and we are now even moving to the construction phase to deliver the new library for Haxby and Wigginton, something that we set out to do from day one. And with that, I'm happy to support the 3 recommendations outlined in paragraph 5. I'll just give a couple of seconds in case any colleagues want to add anything. If not, we've got those recommendations. So if I could please see from those who are happy to accept them. So that's clear consensus in favour of that. Thank you very much. And that then takes us on to agenda item 8. As far as I'm aware, just looking to my right, there is no urgent business this evening. So just a final thank you for those who joined us and watched the meeting at this evening's executive. Thank you. Sorry, Neil is just indicating.